This is the Canon EF 300mm f2.8 lens. This is not. This is the Canon EF M55 to 200 zoom, variable aperture f4.5 to 6.3. Do I need this lens, or can I just get the same or similar enough images using a much smaller, lighter, cheaper setup with a lens like this on the M50? I went out, I took the same shots using both of these lenses on different cameras, this on the R5, this on the M50, and we're going to look at it in the computer today and compare them and see, do you need to spend several $1,000s when you can spend a few hundred? Let's check it out. So there's obviously a very distinct reason and advantage to using a lens like this, a fixed aperture 2.8 lens, compared to, at the long end of this lens, a 6.3 aperture. You're basically getting about 2.5 times more light with a lens like this compared to this, and with a shallower depth of field at 2.8, you're getting a nicer, background blur, a nicer separation between your subject and your background. But we find that a lot of situations when we're shooting landscapes, when we're shooting waterfalls, I'm at f5.6, f8, f11 in those situations, and I don't necessarily need to be at 2.8. It's great when you have it, but do I need to carry around a big heavy lens, take up a lot of room in my bag for shots that I'm getting at f8 when I can just get the same shots with a much lighter, cheaper setup? So what I did is I mounted this lens to my R5. That setup being between the lens and the camera, you're talking about a $7,000 plus setup, this being an older lens. With the newer version of the 300mm lens, the 2.8 lens, even more than that. Several $1,000s basically, and a lot of size and weight. With this setup, this mounted to the M50, you're talking about maybe $600 or $700, and very small and light. So a difference of 10 times basically. You can get 10 of these for one of these. So what I did is I just kind of went around, I took a few pictures at f8, the same images using both lenses. Now this one's at 200mm, but since the M50 is a crop sensor, it's a smaller sensor, you're basically getting an equivalent of about 300mm when you're shooting this at 200. So that's why it's really kind of comparable. So I took some shots, we're going to go into the computer, look at them and see, is there a difference? Is there enough of a difference? So let's check it out. So these are raw files straight out of the camera. I didn't do any adjusting to them at all. I think I got the framing pretty close. On the left-hand side, we have the 300mm 2.8 with the R5, and on the right, the 55 to 200 zoom on the M50. You'll see a small difference in the depth of field. Has to do with the difference between shooting one at 200mm, basically enlarged with the smaller sensor, versus a native 300mm. But both of these were shot at f8, and you can see basically just from looking at this, other than the slight depth of field difference, you can see the very comparable images. The color is nice, the contrast is nice. So let's dig in and see how sharp they are. So now this is 100% crop, the R5 on the left, the M50 on the right, and yeah, it's a little bit sharper. The R5 with the 300mm lens is a little bit sharper, but really you're splitting hairs at this point. We're zoomed in at 100%, zoom back out again, and you can see there really is no difference from this perspective. And again, this will come up as a theme here, but basically it depends on what you're using it for, what you're going to use these images for. If you're going to blow it up to mural size, yeah, it might make a difference. But on a computer screen, on a phone, something like this, you're really not going to see as much of a difference in the sharpness comparing one to the other. They're both very sharp. And here, just for comparison purposes, I changed the image on the left from 8.0 to 2.8, and you can see where the advantage really is in having that wide prime lens, is that if you want to blur that background at 2.8 on the left, you can do it. With the lens on the right, you can't. This is basically, it maxes out at, widest is at 6.3. I'm shooting at 8.0, but you can't really get any wider than that. So if you want to blur the background with the M50 and this zoom combination, you really can't do that. But again, what we really want to compare here is the stop-down version, f8, f11, things like that. Here's another image, R5 on the left, M50 on the right. Aside from the lighting, they look pretty similar. Let's zoom in and see how they look. And you can see on the left, the R5, again, it's going to have an advantage. It's super sharp. The lens is an awesome lens. On the right, the M50 is, in comparison, softer, but if you weren't looking at the image on the left, if you're only looking at the M50 image, it looks really nice. It's really sharp. The colors are good, the contrast is good. It really looks nice. So then again, the question becomes, if you're stopped down and you're looking for everything to be basically in focus, is there really an advantage? So let's take a look at an image where it's just a flat image, everything's in focus. So here again, the R5 on the left, the M50 on the right, and you can see this is basically the same image. The exposure is off maybe slightly. Like I said, I haven't adjusted this at all, but if you want to dig into the center, again, a very slight advantage on the left in sharpness, but you're only comparing, you're comparing it to one of the best cameras and one of the best lenses. The M50 with this $300 zoom lens on the right really does a great job here. If you want to look at the corners, we'll see what it looks like. A little bit more of a difference in the corners. It gets a little bit soft, but not much on the M50 on the right. But again, is it worth it to spend several $1,000s and carry around a huge, heavy setup versus having something that basically you can fit in your pocket? And I guess that's the question that you have to ask is, what am I really doing here? What am I going to do with these images? Who am I going to show them to? Am I just going to look at them on my computer, on my phone? And when is good enough good enough? And if you're not using the camera for really, wide aperture stuff, low light stuff, really trying to blur the backgrounds and things like that, if you're not using it for that, if you find that you're shooting at a smaller aperture, f8, f11 more and more often, and a lot of your shots like that, and you're really not looking for the wider aperture stuff, you don't necessarily need the big, heavy, expensive setup. And that's what, why we kind of say all the time here is when you're starting out, especially if this is, your first camera, or maybe you're getting into digital now, or maybe getting into mirrorless now, is to start with the entry level. Start with the basic, the cheapest, not the cheapest, but the least expensive setup, and then build from there. So rather than going in for, a $2,000 camera and getting $500 to $700 to $1,000 lenses, get, something like the M50 with the kit zoom, and then add a $300 zoom lens on top of it, and see if that's good enough, if that works for you. If that's all you need and you're not looking for more than that, then you've got everything you need, and you'll be happy that you'll spend more time shooting because you're not carrying around. You don't have to get a backpack ready and pack it up, and there's limits to how much gear you can carry around versus your creativity. So if you can only last so long carrying a 25-pound pack around, and there's only so long you can hold it in your hands and be shooting with it before it starts to decrease your creativity, then maybe a smaller, lighter setup is something that you want to look into. And I'm going to put links to all of this stuff, the M50 stuff, the lenses and stuff, the Amazon links in the description below, so you can check those out. But like I said, start small, start light. If you find that you're just shooting a lot of landscapes, you're just shooting a lot of small aperture stuff, you want everything to be in focus, you're getting comparable enough. We're being very nitpicky with these things when we're zooming in 100% and looking at fine details. You're not going to see enough of a difference. You're really not going to see enough of a difference between images shot at, even wide open images. Let's just take a quick look here. We'll go back into the computer. Let's take a look at the f2.8. So on the left here is the R5 with 300 millimeters at 2.8 compared to the same image from the M50 at 8.0 on the right. And zoom all the way and you get basically the same results. So if I'm shooting with this 2.8 lens, even wide open at 2.8, I'm getting no distinct advantage whatsoever using that versus the smaller M50 setup. So again, it comes down to what you're using it for in the end. Are you going to be using your images for just on your computer, on your phone, or are you going to be blowing them up to, 3 foot by 4 foot wall images? It depends on what you're using it for. So M50, we've been using the M50 for a few years now for the videos. I'm shooting a video on it here. We've been using it kind of in casual photography with family and things like that, just to have a camera with us. It really is a great setup. And this lens is 55 to 200 lens. It's the EFM lens. It really is a nice lens, comparable to something like this. in certain situations, in ideal situations. So if you're going to be shooting in ideal situations, landscapes, things like that, when you need to get more extreme, dark situations, really high speed stuff, that's where, the big expensive stuff like an R5 and a lens like this comes into play. But look, if you're using an M50 with a kit zoom and it's getting the job done for you, that's what you need. That's all you need. So any questions or comments that you have about anything like this setup versus that, any successes or failures you've had with different things like this, put them in the comments below. We love to hear from you. Thanks a lot for watching, and we'll see you next time. Millimeters